Someone disrespects you in front of other people. Your chest tightens, your thoughts speed up. You can feel the anger rising before a single word leaves your mouth. Every instinct pushes you toward the same reaction. Defend yourself, raise your voice, prove that your silence is not weakness. But the moment another person gains control over your emotions, they gain influence over your mind. That is the part most people never stop to consider. They spend years believing anger is strength, when in reality, uncontrolled anger is surrender. The Stoics understood this long before the modern world turned emotional reactivity into entertainment. Most people do not realize how much of their inner peace depends on external behavior. One careless comment can ruin an entire evening. One moment of disrespect can replay in the mind for years. Not because the event itself was powerful, but because the mind gave it a permanent place to live. That is how emotional dependence quietly forms. The outside world enters the mind and begins shaping thoughts, moods, and reactions without resistance. Over time, people stop governing themselves and start living at the mercy of whatever happens around them. The Stoics warned about this constantly because a person who cannot govern their inner world will always remain vulnerable to the outer one. Real strength has never been loud. It has never belonged to the person who reacts first, speaks the most, or loses control the fastest. Real strength is quieter than that. It is the ability to remain steady while chaos unfolds around you, to stay clear while others become emotional, to hear criticism without collapsing into anger or insecurity. Stoicism was never about suppressing emotion or pretending not to feel. It was about reaching a state where external chaos no longer dictates your inner condition, because once you learn to master your reactions, something changes permanently. The world loses one of its greatest weapons against you. Most people move through life believing their emotions belong entirely to them, but one difficult interaction is enough to prove otherwise. A careless remark from a stranger can linger in the mind for hours. A dismissive tone from someone at work can quietly poison an entire evening. Even a look of disrespect can follow someone home and replay in their thoughts long after the moment has passed. The dangerous part is not the insult itself. It is how normal this loss of control has become. People call it passion. They call it honesty. They call it being real. But beneath all of it is a deeper reality very few people are willing to confront. Most emotional suffering begins the moment the outside world gains unrestricted access to the mind. The Stoics understood this clearly. A person who cannot govern their inner world will always remain vulnerable to the outer one. That idea feels uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that anger simply happens automatically. But anger rarely arrives all at once. It begins with interpretation. Someone says something careless, and the mind labels it as disrespect. The ego steps forward and demands protection. Then the body follows. The chest tightens. Thoughts accelerate. Judgment weakens. Within seconds, another person has influenced your entire internal state without touching you once. That is not power. It is surrender disguised as self-expression. Society encourages this constantly. People are often praised for losing control, while calmness gets mistaken for weakness. The loudest person in the room is treated as passionate and authentic, while the composed person is called detached or cold. Yet noise has never been proof of strength. In many cases, it is evidence of a mind that has lost balance. The Stoics viewed composure differently. To them, remaining steady under pressure was one of the clearest signs of discipline, because it meant the outside world no longer had unlimited access to the mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed by the color of its thoughts, and most people spend years allowing negative experiences to stain them without resistance. Criticism becomes part of their identity. Rejection becomes proof in their mind that they are unworthy. An embarrassing moment becomes a wound they continue reopening in private. Over time, these experiences reshape the way they move through life. They become defensive, anxious, emotionally fragile. Eventually, they stop responding to reality itself and start responding to old emotional wounds instead. The strange part is that many people never question this condition because emotional suffering has become so common that it feels natural. Yet there is another way to exist. Emotional control is not something people are simply born with. It is trained. The space between an event and a reaction can be widened. Thoughts can be observed instead of obeyed instantly. Emotions can be felt without being allowed to dominate behavior. That shift changes everything because the calmest person in the room is rarely the weakest. More often, they are the person who has learned not to hand their mind over to every passing emotion. They listen without becoming consumed. They face disrespect without collapsing into anger. They understand that protecting inner stability matters more than winning temporary battles driven by pride. And once someone reaches that point, manipulation becomes far more difficult because the world can no longer reach inside them and pull their emotions in whatever direction it chooses. The Stoics believed suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the meaning attached to them. That realization changes the entire structure of emotional pain because it forces a person to confront the possibility that much of their suffering is being created internally. Someone ignores a message, and the mind immediately builds a story around rejection. Someone offers criticism, and the ego transforms a simple opinion into an attack on personal worth. Another person succeeds, and insecurity quietly interprets that success as proof of failure. In every case, the emotion arrives after the interpretation, not before. Yet most people move through life so quickly that they never notice this process unfolding inside them. This is why two people can experience the exact same event and react completely differently. One becomes consumed by anger, while another remains calm and continues with their day untouched. The external event remained the same. The difference existed entirely in perception. One mind created a threat where the other saw information. The Stoics trained themselves to interrupt this process before emotional chaos fully formed. They paused. They observed. They created distance between the event and the story attached to it. That distance changes everything because it allows someone to question their first interpretation instead of worshipping it automatically. Most people never enter that space. They react instantly because they have trained themselves to obey emotion the moment it appears. But emotional discipline begins the moment observation becomes stronger than impulse. Over time, this changes the relationship people have with conflict entirely. Disrespect no longer feels automatically personal. Criticism stops feeling like a threat against identity. Failure loses some of its emotional weight because failure itself is rarely the true source of suffering. The deeper pain usually comes from what the mind decides the failure means. This is why calmness unsettles emotional people. They expect intensity, they expect reaction, they expect visible emotional movement. But composure creates uncertainty, and uncertainty disrupts emotional control. A calm person becomes difficult to manipulate because they are no longer responding automatically to every emotional trigger placed in front of them. Most people spend their lives exhausting themselves emotionally because they react to everything. Every inconvenience becomes personal. Every criticism becomes psychological warfare. Every disagreement becomes a battle for identity. Over time, this constant emotional stimulation destroys inner peace completely. The Stoics practiced selective attention instead. They focused only on what truly mattered and treated everything else as noise. Not every insult deserves acknowledgement. Not every opinion deserves emotional investment. Not every person deserves unrestricted access to your thoughts. That mindset creates enormous freedom because emotional stability stops depending on perfect circumstances. A person no longer needs every interaction to unfold exactly the way they hoped in order to remain calm internally. Patience becomes easier. Silence becomes easier. Even difficult people lose much of their emotional influence because the mind stops treating every irritation like an emergency. This is where emotional independence begins, not by eliminating emotion, but by refusing to become controlled by it. One of the hardest truths to accept is that most people are projecting their inner chaos onto everyone around them. The angry person usually carries frustration that existed long before the conversation began. The disrespectful person is often trying to reclaim a sense of power they feel missing somewhere else in life. Even people who constantly criticize others are usually revealing more about themselves than the person standing in front of them. Yet most people never stop long enough to recognize this. They interpret every negative interaction personally, as though every harsh word is a direct statement about their worth. That interpretation creates unnecessary suffering because it traps the mind inside emotional reaction instead of understanding the deeper psychology behind behavior. Once perception begins shifting in this direction, interactions start feeling different. Observation quietly replaces emotional impulse. A rude comment no longer feels like undeniable proof that you were attacked personally. It begins looking more like evidence of someone else's internal instability. The Stoics reminded themselves constantly that human beings are emotional, insecure, impulsive creatures trying to survive their own minds. Once someone truly accepts that reality, disappointment becomes less shocking. People will misunderstand you. They will project their frustration onto you unfairly. They will occasionally behave selfishly or emotionally. This is not an exception to life. It is part of life. The moment someone stops demanding perfection from imperfect people, emotional resistance begins fading naturally. That does not mean approving of harmful behavior or becoming passive. It simply means recognizing reality honestly instead of fighting against it emotionally. Acceptance removes friction, not approval. Acceptance. Emotional outrage rarely changes anything. Clear thinking does. Emotional discipline does. The person who remains calm while everyone else loses control quietly changes the entire dynamic of the interaction. Not through aggression or intimidation, but through clarity. And clarity becomes powerful because it cannot be easily manipulated by emotional chaos anymore. Eventually, this way of thinking transforms the entire atmosphere surrounding a person. They become slower to anger, harder to provoke, less emotionally dependent on validation, praise, or approval from others. The need to prove themselves constantly begins disappearing. Silence no longer feels uncomfortable because identity no longer depends on winning every conversation emotionally. This is the freedom the Stoics were pointing toward all along. Not freedom from problems or difficult people, but freedom from being psychologically controlled by them. Life continues changing. Chaos still appears. Disrespect still happens. But beneath all of it, there is steadiness. A quiet sense that your peace no longer depends on the world behaving perfectly in order for you to remain whole internally. And once someone reaches that point, the world loses much of its ability to disturb them because their inner stability no longer belongs to outside forces. If these ideas resonate with you, please subscribe. There are very few places left that encourage stillness, discipline, and clarity in a world built on distraction and emotional chaos. And sometimes one shift in perspective is enough to change the way you move through life forever. This is why two individuals can experience the exact same event and walk away with completely different emotional states. One person faces criticism and spends the entire night consumed by anger, replaying every detail in their mind as though they were wounded personally. Another listens calmly, considers whether the criticism contains truth, and then continues with their day untouched. The external event remained the same. The difference existed entirely in perception. One mind created a threat where the other saw information. One interpreted discomfort as humiliation, while the other treated it as part of life. Once this becomes clear, emotional freedom starts to feel less mysterious and far more practical. The mind is not simply reacting to reality, it is constantly interpreting reality, shaping experience through judgment, memory, fear, and personal identity. That process happens so automatically that many people never stop to examine it. Their emotions appear immediate, almost mechanical. Anger rises, and they obey it. Embarrassment appears, and they collapse inward. Jealousy enters the mind, and suddenly their peace disappears. The Stoics trained themselves to interrupt this cycle before it fully formed. They practiced slowing down their reactions long enough to observe what was happening internally. Epictetus once said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." A moment of silence, a measured breath, a brief pause before speaking. These small acts seem insignificant at first, but they create distance between an event and the emotional story attached to it. Within that distance, clarity begins to appear. A person starts realizing that not every thought deserves belief, and not every emotion deserves obedience. That awareness changes the relationship people have with conflict. Disrespect no longer feels automatically personal because the mind learns to question its first interpretation instead of worshipping it. A disagreement stops feeling like a threat to identity. Even failure begins losing some of its emotional weight because failure itself is rarely the true source of suffering. The deeper pain often comes from what the mind decides the failure means. People tell themselves they are falling behind, becoming irrelevant, disappointing others, wasting their potential. These interpretations deepen the wound far more than the original event. Once someone understands this, they begin protecting their inner world differently. They stop allowing temporary emotions to define permanent truths about themselves. This level of discipline unsettles emotional people because calmness exposes how unstable most reactions truly are. Someone who remains composed during tension disrupts the usual emotional exchange. There is nothing to feed on, no visible insecurity to manipulate, no impulsive reaction to escalate. Emotional people often expect others to mirror their intensity, and when that reflection does not appear, confusion enters the interaction. Calmness creates a kind of psychological silence that many people are uncomfortable sitting inside. They mistake composure for weakness because they have spent their entire lives associating emotional intensity with authenticity. Yet true steadiness often requires far more strength than uncontrolled expression ever will. The deeper someone goes into this way of thinking, the more they begin noticing how much suffering in daily life is created by interpretation rather than reality itself. Traffic becomes an insult. Delays become personal attacks against comfort. Criticism becomes proof of inadequacy. Small inconveniences gather emotional weight because the mind keeps assigning unnecessary meaning to ordinary experiences. This constant interpretation exhausts people mentally. They carry emotional tension from moment to moment without realizing they are participating in its creation. The Stoics tried to break that pattern by returning attention to what was actually happening instead of the dramatic story forming around it. A harsh comment was simply words. A setback was simply a setback. They understood that reality becomes heavier when the mind insists on turning every difficult moment into evidence of personal suffering. Over time, this practice creates a noticeable shift in presence. A person becomes harder to provoke, harder to manipulate. Their reactions slow down, and their thinking becomes clearer because they are no longer trapped inside every emotion that enters the mind. They begin responding deliberately instead of reacting impulsively. That difference changes relationships, decisions, and even the atmosphere surrounding them. People sense when someone cannot be easily disturbed. There is a steadiness in their behavior that feels grounded and difficult to influence. Not coldness, not emotional suppression, just control. And in a world where most people are ruled by immediate feeling, control becomes a rare form of power. Eventually, the mind stops treating every discomfort as an emergency. Criticism loses its ability to shake identity. Even difficult people begin revealing more about themselves than about you. That is disciplined perception. The outside world remains unpredictable, but your inner state no longer rises and falls with every opinion, mood, or moment. Peace becomes something carried within instead of being searched for outside. Modern culture encourages the opposite approach. People are expected to react instantly to everything. Every opinion demands a response. Every criticism demands a defense. Silence is treated like weakness because visibility has become confused with confidence. Yet the people who constantly explain themselves are often the people least certain of who they are. They feel pressure to prove their emotions publicly because they need reassurance from the outside world. The Stoics understood that restraint creates a different kind of presence. A calm person does not rush to defend every misunderstanding because they are not emotionally dependent on controlling how others perceive them. That level of control changes interactions immediately. Emotional people become unsettled when they cannot predict someone's reaction. They expect conflict, emotion, noise, or defense, and when none arrives, uncertainty takes its place. Uncertainty changes the balance of power in subtle ways. When someone tries to provoke an emotional response and receives calmness instead, they begin questioning themselves internally. Their expectations collapse. They cannot read the situation clearly anymore because emotional access has been removed. Most people rely heavily on reactions to understand where they stand with others. They search faces for signs of approval, anger, insecurity, or fear. But calmness interrupts that process. It creates distance between what someone says and the emotional reaction they expected to receive. That distance feels uncomfortable for people who depend on emotional control to navigate conversations. Silence suddenly becomes heavier than words because it forces others to sit alone with their own behavior. Most people struggle with this because they confuse emotional expression with emotional honesty. They believe every feeling deserves immediate release. Anger enters the mind and instantly becomes speech. Frustration appears and immediately shapes behavior. But emotions are not commands. They are experiences passing through the mind, often influenced by exhaustion, insecurity, memory, or fear. The problem begins when people stop observing emotions and start obeying them automatically. A moment of irritation becomes an argument. A wounded ego becomes revenge. A passing insecurity becomes self-destruction. This happens every day because people rarely pause long enough to examine what they are feeling before acting on it. The Stoics practiced a different approach. They trained themselves to notice emotion without immediately surrendering to it. That does not mean suppressing feelings or pretending to be unaffected. It means recognizing that emotions contain information, not authority. Seneca once wrote, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." Anger may reveal that a boundary was crossed. Fear may reveal uncertainty about the future. Jealousy may expose insecurity that needs attention. But none of those emotions deserve total control over behavior. The moment a person understands this distinction, emotional life becomes less chaotic. Feelings still appear, but they stop dominating every decision and interaction. That shift creates emotional independence, and emotional independence changes the entire atmosphere surrounding a person. Criticism no longer enters the nervous system with the same intensity. Misunderstandings stop feeling catastrophic. Disrespect loses much of its power because identity is no longer built entirely on external validation. A person begins moving through life with greater steadiness because they are not constantly reacting to every emotional impulse that enters the mind. This steadiness does not make someone cold, it makes them clear. Their thinking remains intact under pressure because they no longer allow temporary emotions to completely overtake perception. In a world where most people are ruled by immediate feeling, clarity becomes rare, and rare qualities always carry quiet influence. Over time, this discipline becomes visible without needing explanation. People notice when someone cannot be easily provoked. Conversations feel different around them because there is no desperation to win every exchange or defend every opinion. They remain present instead of reactive. That presence creates trust in some people and discomfort in others. Emotional people often interpret calmness as distance because they are used to relationships built entirely on reaction and intensity. Yet true steadiness is not emotional emptiness, it is control. It is the ability to experience emotion without becoming consumed by it. Once that ability is developed consistently, the mind stops feeling like a battlefield controlled by outside forces. It becomes a place of observation, choice, and quiet stability, even during difficult moments. The deepest emotional reactions rarely come from the moment itself. They come from the attachment hidden beneath it. A person speaks to you with less respect than you expected, and suddenly irritation appears almost instantly. Someone overlooks your effort, ignores your presence, or dismisses your opinion, and the mind begins reacting as though something valuable has been taken away. Most people believe anger is the real issue in these moments, but anger is often only the surface expression of something deeper. Underneath it is attachment to recognition, attachment to approval, attachment to being seen a certain way by other people. The ego quietly builds expectations about how life should unfold and how others should behave, and when reality refuses to cooperate with those expectations, emotional stability begins collapsing almost immediately. This is why two people can experience the same rejection and respond completely differently. One person becomes consumed by resentment while the other remains steady and continues moving forward. The difference is rarely external strength, it is internal dependence. The more someone depends on outside validation to maintain their sense of worth, the more fragile their emotional world becomes. The Stoics warned about this constantly because they understood how dangerous it is to build inner peace on things that can disappear at any moment. Reputation changes, status fades, relationships end, public opinion shifts without warning. Even admiration from others is temporary because people are inconsistent by nature. A person who depends entirely on those things for emotional balance will spend most of life anxious, defensive, and emotionally exposed. Many people never realize how much energy they waste trying to control how they are perceived. They replay conversations repeatedly in their mind, searching for signs of approval or rejection. They become obsessed with being understood perfectly by everyone around them. A single misunderstanding can ruin their confidence for hours because their emotional state depends heavily on outside confirmation. This creates a constant feeling of pressure. Every interaction starts carrying emotional weight because identity itself feels unstable. The Stoics approached life differently. They focused less on controlling perception and more on controlling character. They understood that other people's opinions exist outside personal control, which means attaching identity to those opinions guarantees instability. Once someone truly accepts this, a different kind of calm begins to appear. That calmness is not emotional numbness, it is emotional independence. There is a major difference between the two, although many people confuse them. Emotional numbness disconnects a person from life completely. Emotional independence allows someone to experience life without becoming emotionally dominated by every reaction, criticism, or disappointment they encounter. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." A person can still value relationships, appreciate respect, and care deeply about meaningful connections while understanding that their inner stability cannot depend entirely on those things. This understanding changes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. There is less desperation during conversations, less need to prove intelligence, superiority, or importance. People who become emotionally self-sufficient stop chasing reassurance constantly because they no longer need the outside world to confirm their value every moment. Ironically, this detachment often creates more respect instead of less. Others sense when someone is grounded internally. There is a steadiness in the way they speak, react, and carry themselves. They do not collapse emotionally during disagreement. They do not become defensive over every criticism. They are able to listen without immediately turning conflict into a threat against identity. That kind of presence feels rare because modern life encourages the opposite. People are constantly taught to seek validation publicly, to measure their worth through attention, approval, and comparison. As a result, emotional reactions become exaggerated because identity itself becomes dependent on unstable external conditions. A calm person interrupts that pattern simply by refusing to participate in it. Once perception begins shifting in this direction, interactions start feeling different. Instead of becoming immediately offended by someone's behavior, observation quietly takes the place of emotional impulse. A rude comment no longer feels like undeniable proof that you were attacked personally. It begins looking more like evidence of someone else's internal instability. That does not excuse harmful behavior, but it changes the emotional relationship you have with it. The Stoics practiced this kind of thinking constantly because they understood how dangerous it is to assume people will always behave rationally. Human beings are emotional, insecure, impulsive, and deeply affected by experiences nobody else can fully see. Most people are carrying invisible tension into every interaction without realizing how much it shapes the way they speak and behave. Many people suffer emotionally because they expect others to behave according to their own internal standards. They expect maturity from immature people, self-awareness from emotionally unaware people, kindness from people who are consumed by their own unresolved pain. When those expectations collapse, frustration appears immediately because reality refuses to match the image created inside the mind. The Stoics approached life differently. They accepted human imperfection as part of reality itself. People will disappoint you. They will misunderstand your intentions. Some will project their frustration onto you unfairly. Others will judge you through the lens of their own insecurity. This is not an exception to life. It is part of life. The moment someone fully accepts this truth, emotional resistance begins fading. Not because the world becomes kinder, but because the mind stops demanding perfection from imperfect people. That acceptance removes enormous amounts of unnecessary tension. Most emotional suffering comes from arguing internally with reality instead of understanding it. People repeat the same thoughts endlessly in their mind. They should not have treated me that way. They should understand me better. They should respect me more. Yet reality continues unfolding independently of those expectations. Epictetus once said, "Do not seek for things to happen as you wish, but wish for things to happen as they do happen, and your life will go smoothly." Emotional resistance changes nothing except the state of the person resisting. Acceptance, on the other hand, creates calmness because it allows someone to see situations clearly without adding unnecessary emotional weight to them. Acceptance does not mean approval. It simply means recognizing reality honestly instead of fighting against what already exists. This shift also changes the way difficult people affect your nervous system. Their behavior still matters, but it stops entering your mind with the same level of emotional force. You begin seeing emotional chaos as something many people unconsciously spread because they do not know how to carry their own inner struggles properly. Some people walk into every room searching for conflict because conflict distracts them from themselves. Others constantly provoke reactions because controlling someone emotionally gives them temporary relief from feeling powerless internally. Once this pattern becomes visible, emotional reactions begin slowing down naturally. Observation starts replacing judgment. Clarity starts replacing personal offense. The Stoics trained themselves to remember this constantly because it protected them from unnecessary anger. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on the reality that human beings make mistakes, not because they always intend evil, but because they are confused, emotional, and limited by their own understanding. That perspective creates patience without weakness. A calm person does not become emotionally shattered every time someone behaves poorly because they understand human nature more realistically. They stop being surprised by selfishness, dishonesty, or emotional immaturity. And when surprise disappears, emotional stability becomes easier to maintain. Over time, this creates a noticeable shift in presence. A person becomes harder to provoke because they no longer interpret every negative interaction through the lens of ego. They respond more carefully. They listen more clearly. Their emotional state stops rising and falling with every difficult personality they encounter. This kind of steadiness becomes powerful because emotional people depend heavily on reactions from others. When those reactions disappear, manipulation becomes much harder. Calmness interrupts emotional games completely. The person who remains centered while others lose control quietly changes the entire dynamic of the interaction. Not through force, not through aggression, through clarity. And clarity is difficult to overpower because it is not driven by emotional chaos or wounded pride anymore. One of the clearest differences between emotionally reactive people and emotionally disciplined people is the way they experience time. Emotional people live inside the immediate moment. They want relief instantly. They want revenge instantly. They want validation, recognition, and emotional satisfaction without delay. Their decisions are often shaped by whatever feeling happens to be strongest at that particular second. Anger pushes them to speak before thinking. Pride pushes them to defend themselves before understanding the situation clearly. Frustration pushes them toward impulsive action because silence feels unbearable. Yet the need for immediate emotional release often creates consequences that last far longer than the original emotion itself. One reckless sentence spoken in anger can permanently damage trust built over years. One impulsive reaction can alter how people see you for the rest of your life. Temporary emotions create permanent outcomes every day because most people never learn how to separate feeling from action. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed discipline was not simply about controlling behavior in the present moment. It was about protecting the future from the instability of the present mind. That requires patience, and patience has become increasingly rare because modern culture rewards immediacy. People are encouraged to react instantly, post instantly, respond instantly, defend themselves instantly. Waiting feels uncomfortable because waiting forces someone to sit with emotion instead of discharging it immediately. Yet, emotional urgency is often the very thing that destroys clarity. A person who cannot tolerate emotional discomfort becomes easy to manipulate because their reactions become predictable. Press the right emotional button and they respond automatically. Calm people operate differently because they are not controlled entirely by emotional timing. They understand that not every feeling deserves immediate expression. This creates a very different relationship with conflict. Emotional people tend to treat every disagreement like a battle that must be won immediately. Every criticism feels urgent. Every insult demands a response. Every inconvenience becomes emotionally charged. Over time, this constant engagement drains enormous amounts of mental energy. The mind never rests because it remains trapped in endless cycles of reaction. A rude comment ruins the morning. Traffic ruins the afternoon. A difficult conversation ruins the evening. By the end of the day, exhaustion appears not because life itself was unbearable, but because emotional energy was spent reacting to every unpleasant experience encountered along the way. Most people are not tired from reality alone. They are tired from their constant resistance to reality. Calm people conserve energy differently. They understand that attention is limited, and where attention goes, emotional energy follows. Instead of emotionally attaching themselves to every conflict, they become selective. They choose carefully what deserves their focus and what does not. This is not avoidance. It is discernment. There is a major difference between ignoring important issues and refusing to waste emotional energy on meaningless tension. The Stoics practiced this kind of selective attention constantly. They recognized that many things capable of disturbing the mind are ultimately insignificant when viewed from a wider perspective. Not every insult deserves acknowledgement. Not every criticism deserves emotional investment. Not every person deserves unrestricted access to your thoughts. This mindset creates a quieter kind of strength because emotional stability stops depending on perfect circumstances. A person no longer needs every interaction to unfold exactly the way they hoped in order to remain calm. Delays stop feeling catastrophic. Disrespect stops feeling deeply personal. Even difficult people lose much of their emotional influence because the mind no longer reacts automatically to every external trigger. Seneca once wrote, "He who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." This creates space internally, space to think clearly, space to observe instead of immediately defend, space to decide consciously whether something truly deserves emotional involvement. Most conflict becomes smaller once someone stops feeding it endless emotional attention. Over time, this way of living begins changing the nervous system itself. The constant emotional stimulation that once felt normal starts feeling unnecessary and exhausting. The desire to argue over meaningless things weakens naturally. Silence becomes more comfortable. Solitude becomes more restorative. A person begins noticing how much unnecessary noise dominates daily life and how often people create suffering simply because they cannot sit peacefully with temporary discomfort. Emotional discipline removes much of this chaos because it teaches the mind to stop treating every irritation like an emergency. This does not mean life becomes free from conflict or disappointment. Difficult moments still arrive. Frustration still appears. Anger still enters the mind occasionally because emotion itself is part of being human. The difference is that emotions stop controlling direction completely. They become experiences to observe rather than commands to obey automatically. That shift creates stability. A stable mind moves differently through life because it is no longer scattered across endless emotional battles that never truly mattered in the first place. Eventually, emotional restraint stops feeling forced and starts feeling natural. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer wasting energy reacting to every disturbance surrounding it. Attention narrows toward what truly matters, while the rest fades into background noise. That is why calm people often appear powerful without trying to appear powerful at all. Their energy remains intact because they stopped surrendering it to meaningless conflict long ago. At a certain point, the struggle begins changing shape. Emotional discipline no longer feels like something forced or artificial. It stops feeling like a constant battle against every reaction, every irritation, every difficult person encountered throughout the day. Instead, it becomes part of the way you naturally move through life. The need to defend yourself constantly starts fading quietly in the background. Arguments lose their emotional urgency. Criticism no longer enters the mind with the same destructive force. Even the desire to prove your worth to people begins weakening because your identity no longer depends entirely on outside recognition. Something steadier takes its place. For the first time, peace stops feeling temporary. It becomes internal rather than conditional. Most people spend years believing peace depends on controlling circumstances. They think calmness will arrive once life becomes easier, once people behave better, once respect becomes guaranteed, once success removes insecurity. But life never remains stable long enough for that strategy to work. Difficult people continue existing. Misunderstandings continue happening. Disappointment continues appearing in unexpected moments. The Stoics understood this clearly. They never promised a life free from frustration or conflict because they knew external reality could never be controlled completely. Their focus was always directed inward. They believed the real goal was not removing difficulty from life, but removing the unnecessary suffering created by uncontrolled reactions to difficulty. That distinction changes everything because it shifts power back into your hands. Once someone understands this deeply, emotional control becomes less about suppression and more about freedom. Freedom from compulsive reaction. Freedom from the exhausting need to win every conflict emotionally. Freedom from becoming mentally trapped inside the opinions and behavior of other people. The outside world still moves unpredictably, but the inner world stops collapsing every time circumstances fail to cooperate with personal expectations. That creates a completely different relationship with life itself. Challenges remain difficult, but they stop feeling emotionally catastrophic. Rejection still stings, but it no longer destroys identity. Criticism still reaches the mind, but it no longer defines self-worth automatically. This transformation happens gradually through repeated moments of awareness. A person notices anger appearing, but chooses silence instead of immediate reaction. They notice insecurity rising, but refuse to let it shape behavior completely. They observe frustration without becoming consumed by it. At first, these moments require effort, because emotional habits built over years do not disappear instantly. Most people have spent their entire lives reacting automatically to discomfort. They learn to obey emotion immediately without questioning whether the emotion deserved control over their actions. Breaking that pattern takes patience. Yet, with enough repetition, the mind slowly becomes quieter. Reactions slow down. Thoughts become clearer. Emotional turbulence loses some of its authority. Eventually, this calmness becomes visible even without explanation. People notice something different, although they often cannot describe exactly what it is. There is less tension in the way emotionally disciplined people carry themselves, less desperation in conversation, less urgency in conflict. They listen without appearing threatened. They remain steady during situations that emotionally overwhelm others. This steadiness creates a kind of silent influence because emotional stability is rare. Most people are constantly pulled in different directions by anxiety, pride, frustration, comparison, and the endless pressure of modern life. Someone who remains grounded despite all of that naturally stands apart. The powerful part is that this calmness does not come from controlling other people. It comes from no longer needing to control them emotionally in order to feel stable internally. That difference matters deeply. Many people seek peace by trying to manipulate circumstances around them. They want everyone to understand them perfectly, respect them perfectly, behave according to their expectations perfectly. But this creates endless frustration because human beings are unpredictable by nature. The emotionally disciplined person stops demanding perfection from life. They stop expecting reality to constantly protect their ego from discomfort. And because of that acceptance, their peace becomes much harder to disturb. This does not mean becoming passive or emotionally disconnected. The Stoics never believed strength meant feeling nothing. Emotions still exist. Anger still appears occasionally. Sadness still arrives. Disappointment still hurts. The difference is that emotions stop becoming dictators. They no longer control direction automatically. A person learns how to experience emotion without surrendering judgment entirely to it. That creates enormous clarity during difficult moments because reactions are no longer driven purely by wounded pride or temporary frustration. Choices become more deliberate. Words become more measured. Silence becomes more intentional. This is the freedom the Stoics pointed toward all along. Not a perfect life, not permanent happiness. Something deeper. A state where inner peace stops depending on whether the outside world behaves correctly. Life continues changing, Chaos still arrives unexpectedly. People still disappoint each other. Yet beneath all of it, there is steadiness. A quiet sense that your mind belongs to you again. And once someone reaches that point, fear begins losing much of its power because emotional control can no longer be taken away easily. Peace stops feeling fragile. It becomes something carried within regardless of circumstances. That is why true composure feels so powerful when you encounter it in another person. It reflects someone who no longer needs the world to cooperate perfectly in order to remain whole internally. The world will keep testing your patience. People will continue projecting their chaos, their anger, and their insecurities onto anyone willing to carry them. But the moment you stop allowing the outside world to control your inner state, something changes permanently. You move differently, you think differently, you become harder to shake, harder to manipulate, and far more at peace with yourself. That quiet strength is rare now, and that's exactly why it matters. If this message stayed with you, take a moment and watch one of the videos on your screen right now. Keep strengthening the mind. Keep building that inner stability. Most people spend their entire lives searching for outside themselves. And thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.